For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stefano Giordano. I'm the director of the Remarque Institute. You met Lauren, our student assistant downstairs, and if you don't know him, I administratively and MC for the events that we do. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to The Century According to Pier, which was the sort of playful title that sort of randomly came up working on it for an event that is slated basically for almost the 49th anniversary of Pasolini's Merjian, where we were thinking about this with an eye to a very real renaissance of Pasolini writing and scholarship in recent times. The New York Review of Books, as a publisher, has published several of his novels, and Ara brought out his work Heretical Aesthetics, which is Pasolini on painting, earlier this year. And as Robert is a Remarque Fellow this semester, we thought that we would give the event a try. So we have today with us 3 speakers, and I will introduce them as briefly as I can so we can get started. Robert Gorton is the Serena Professor of Italian at the University of Cambridge. He's the author or editor of over 15 books, including Pasolini, Forms of Subjectivity from 1996, as well as books on Primo Levi, The Cultural Memory of the Holocaust in Italy, and 20th Century Literary History. He's a Remarque Fellow this semester and is working on Pasolini in Weimar, a study which is relevant to what you'll speak to us today, of a major cultural festival of European Nazi and fascist youth staged in Weimar in the summer of 1942, which gathered thousands of delegates from 14 countries across Axis and occupied Europe. Among the attendees was Pasolini, at the time 20 years old, and at the very start of his career as a poet, writer, and artist. Our second speaker will be Margaret Scarborough, who received her PhD from Columbia last year. She works both on Pasolini and the feminist and art critic Carla Lonzi, and in her work, she shows how each relied on their formal training and experience as literary and art critics to break with radical and traditional models of political engagement. By largely ignoring contemporary trends, as she shows, they developed their own approaches to life and politics, adopting tools and methods from philology as well as from the related discipline of visual philology. Now, the visual philology line is linked also to the question of Pasolini's writing and art, which is relevant in turn to the last but by no means least of our speakers, Ara Merjian, who is professor of Italian Studies and affiliated faculty of the Institute of Fine Arts and the Department of Art History here at NYU. He's the author of several books, including Against the Avant-Garde, which I actually had in my office, and so I get to showcase it, Pasolini, Contemporary Art and New Capitalism, which appeared in 2020. And he's also the editor, as I mentioned just now, of Heretical Aesthetics, Pasolini and Painting, which came out late last year. His conclusion, his introduction there closes in what I think is a pretty wonderful place for the 3 to begin. Quote, "Neither classical beauty nor mere transgression, neither aesthetics nor heresy will ever suffice to explain Pasolini's poetics and politics of the visual. A stubborn return to the proverbial firing line, a privileging of origins over originality, a dream of the new conjured out of radical regressions fixed in pigment." And so with that, I think, Robert, why don't we have you go first?
Okay, thanks.
Please join me in welcoming our 2 speakers.
Okay, thanks, Stefanos. Thanks to everyone, to Amy, Lauren.
Sam, who's absent.
Sam, who's absent. Right, thanks to her as well. Is it doing the feedback thing?
You should be good now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for everyone for coming. Apologies to the Remarque Fellows who heard a version of this 4 days ago. So hold your breath and wait for the more interesting papers to come. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and do a slideshow, right? Okay to go. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to read mostly to try and keep to time. So yeah, here we are. A young Italian man poses for a photograph, half in shadow. He's impeccably dressed in fascist youth uniform, medals pinned to his chest, flowing black hair brushed to one side, feet set apart, hands clasped low to his front, dark eyes staring awkwardly but piercingly to camera. We're in Weimar, home of Goethe and the heart of German Kultur, just 5 miles away from Buchenwald concentration camp, and it is June 1942. The young man is, of course, a 20-year-old Pier Paolo Pasolini, future writer, filmmaker, artist, and brilliant contrarian Marxist intellectual. On his return from Weimar, Pasolini will publish in August 1942 one of the very first essays of his vast oeuvre reflecting on this visit to Weimar. He'll publish it in the fascist University Youth Culture magazine in Bologna. This is the cover of that same issue. Yeah. Called L'Architrave. In Bologna, he was studying for his degree in literature and art history, following courses by Roberto Longhi, the great art historian, among many others. And he was also publishing his first poetry collection, Poesia Casarsa, was actually published on the 14th of July, so days after he returned to Bologna from Weimar. In fact, that he received his copy of the book, tellingly enough, at a military camp outside Bologna, where he was on a student officer's course, the Allievi Ufficiali training course, 50 or so kilometers outside Bologna. So at the time, we have Pasolini as an energetic, somewhat conventional fascist era student. He was a member of the GUF, the student fascist organization. He took part in sporting competitions, the games, the so-called Ludi Juveniles a couple of years earlier, the Littoriali, the student competitions. He had certain functions within the organization of the Littoral Youth, the GIL organization. For example, a few months later, he would become a consultant to the Youth Art Commission, consulente della Commissione Giovanile per l'Arte of the electoral structure, the GIL, which was the youth cultural organization. Also, Pasolini at this time, we can kind of tell from the photo on the left, was a quintessential bookish young kind of littérateur, right? You can see it in his comportment, much as you could see in the fascist photo, another side of his identity. Literature and art were everywhere in his letters, in his values, in his networks in Bologna, in his first writings. And there's only a very distant hint of any interest in anything political, whether that is pro or anti-fascist. And that's part of what makes this arena so interesting at this particular time. It's fair to say, though, that for large swathes of his generation, the language of literature and cultural criticism was, or at least has been claimed to have been, a kind of code, a kind of lexicon for intervening in public debate in a moment where, or an era where, explicit intervention in a kind of political sense was not particularly possible beyond the conventional kind of rhetorical formulae. A few months later, as anyone who knows about Pasolini knows, late 1942 and certainly into 1943 for Pasolini and for everyone of his generation, everyone in Italy, everything changes. So there's a kind of watershed moment. And what we're looking at here in June 1942, therefore, I think is a sort of Pasolini in suspended animation, a kind of, as I called the talk today, Pasolini before Pasolini. So it's an interesting moment of transition, of suspension, and a kind of seeding moment for whatever it is we think the mystery of the future Pasolini might become. So what was he, in fact, doing, posing in a fascist uniform for a photograph in Weimar in the summer of 1942, just as we should remind ourselves, the war was running deep into its third year, or the second, since Italy had joined in June 1940, had joined the war, as across Europe and North Africa, and indeed Asia, the catastrophe of kind of Axis success was reaching a peak. We have here a few headlines from the Bolognese daily newspaper talking about, around this time, talking about sort of North Africa, the defeat of, or in one stage of the Battle of Tobruk between Libya and Egypt, reports from Sebastopol, from the Eastern Front, let alone, I hardly need to point out or to remind ourselves that we're in the year. So January 1942 was the date of the Wannsee conference. So here we are in Weimar, a few kilometers from Buchenwald, right at the heart of at the peak, as it were, of the launching, let's say, of the genocidal project as well. Pasolini then was in Weimar to participate in this grand, that Stefanos mentioned, this multinational festival of youth culture. It was attended by several thousand students and young activists like himself, regimented in their different national fascist youth groups. This is some documentation from the festival. It was variously named the Ponte Culturale, the Cultural Bridge, or the Kulturbrücke, or the City Axis, the Stadtachse, or indeed, as here, the Manifestazioni Culturali della Gioventù Europea, and I won't try the German there. The participants had traveled to Germany from no fewer than 14 countries around, let's say, Axis or occupied European territory. So it was vastly transnational, taking in the kind of primary Axis powers, the allies, as it were, of the sort of fascist regimes of the tripartite sort of alliance, and then occupied territories, if these distinctions still hold any validity, and including also Spain, a kind of ally from outside the war. It's interesting that we were discussing the other day, there are missing countries. France is a very interesting missing constituent, as is where Alec is, but we were talking about Poland as well the other day. But still, this is an extraordinary array, even logistically, in the summer of 1942, to gather together in Weimar. This vast transnational cultural festival was primarily the creation of the two leading fascist powers, Germany and Italy, and part of a long-running, strained, collaborative cultural venture between the two, which ran in parallel and often with a great deal of kind of tension and conflict within the Rome-Berlin axis. And indeed, this event, the Weimar event, was conceived from the start as a twinned enterprise. It was a Weimar-Florence event, with one part taking place in Weimar a week or so in mid-June, and then straight traveling to Florence for a further week of cultural events and gatherings right at the end of June 1942. We have some images here from the kind of, most of these are all from Weimar actually, but you can fill them with fairly sort of replicable events in Florence, although there are some differences between what went on in each place. It was a twinned enterprise then. The 2 weeks were filled with an array of mass cultural and folklore events, collective activities, performances, conferences, exhibitions, cultural and sporting competitions, a series of dedicated conferences on theatre, radio, publishing, and the press. Music, cinema, art and sculpture were covered by competitions and exhibitions, all with a view to forging a kind of youth contribution to these sectors. They were all covered enthusiastically in local media, in the news press, in art journals, magazines, in those same youth and cultural journals that had drawn Pasolini to participate in the first place. He was there as a kind of winner of a competition via his Bolognese fascist student magazines. And indeed, as we saw, he would report back to those same magazines on his return. Newsreels, included by the Istituto Luce, covered the event in some detail with shorter and longer reportages. And there was also a kind of outflow, as there often were at these events, of kind of material culture, of kind of ephemera, badges, stamps, pins, which I think also have an interesting kind of history to them and give something of the flavor of the kind of experience, the experiential fascination of these events. These objects now circulate on neo-fascist kind of paraphernalia websites. So there's a kind of subculture that's fascinated by these even up to the present day. The Weimar-Florence connection and the confluence of Europe's youth cultural elite thus aimed to cement something like the primacy of a new fascist European cultural order, which was still at this point being forged for the future, despite or perhaps galvanized by the heat of the war, through an extensive series of interconnected propaganda initiatives and events, of which this was only one part. I should say that one of the reasons why this is hidden in plain sight for people working on Pasolini is that this has often been misconstrued. His presence there has often been misconstrued as being present at a later conference, a few months later, also in Weimar, which is much better known in the Italian historiography because some very well-known figures, including Vittorini, Jaime Pintor and others were there in the October event. And this, including in the collected works here, his article on Weimar is mislabeled as being about the October event. So around and in between the official program, it's clear from Pasolini's account that Weimar Florence was also a kind of forum for informal networking, which I think is one of the most interesting things that we can try and recover from this kind of pompous propaganda event. There was network building, there were intense exchanges of ideas, not all of which were in line with the governing ideology of the organizers and the regimes, although we should be careful of not idealizing Pasolini as some kind of subversive presence at these events. There was definitely a kind of euphoria in the way he channeled this. So a couple of quick quotes if I have time. Yeah. So first of all, on this private networking, he says in the midst of his article, he talks about careful private activity. We were able to circumvent the system or formal barriers and almost surreptitiously behind the scenes to survey what he calls the European culture of today. And in terms of the affect here, or the euphoria of this experience of traveling to Weimar and meeting, perhaps for the first time, Spaniards, Poles, young writers, poets, cultural activists, as well as young fascists or Nazis, depending on their provenance. He also talks in this very kind of, as it were, breathless sense at the beginning of the article. Let me say that this article, was written, or rather shouted out, gridato mentre appena tornato da Weimar, just after my return from Weimar, when I had not yet completely freed myself of that exceptional, memorable atmosphere in which my sense of myself as a European made me somehow feel even more, almost desperately, Italian. So this kind of navigating this border between his Italianness, his Europeanness, whatever that may mean, and simply the kind of emotional euphoria. Anyone who works on Pasolini might wonder whether there was a kind of erotic element behind this experience, but I don't suppose we can reconstruct that. Largely forgotten then in accounts of both fascist cultural programs and propaganda and of Pasolini's early biography and intellectual formation, the cultural bridge, the Ponte Culturale, was thus a highly charged moment of convergence and also of contradictory and competing visions. So as I work on this, my questions circulating around it are of the order, what can this event or this moment and this place tell us about generally about the state of the Nazi fascist project? Its still flourishing dream of a European-wide new cultural order and indeed racial order, and its investment in youth and a kind of millennial future. And for Pasolini, what can this scene, and I'd like to say also that photograph, tell us about a particular precocious youth who, along with his whole generation, had grown up and entered adulthood immersed in an education, a set of values, a language, an idea of identity entirely defined by the fascist state and its utopian totalitarian project. And how on earth did the radical Pasolini we know from later years emerge from this kind of chrysalis fascism? So I think that the photograph, that strange and strained photograph of Pasolini in Weimar in 1942, might be said to encapsulate a whole series of ambivalences and the dense significance of this remarkable moment. I don't mean to reprise a very worn out debate now in Italy and across the whole of Europe of who was and wasn't a fascist and when. I don't think that's very interesting. But what we do know about Pasolini is that he persistently, obsessively returned to the language, the word, the lexicon of fascism, all the way through to his very final weeks and months. The use of the term nuovo fascismo in his 70s journalism, the film Salò. Ara can tell us all about his artist and contemporary present at some of these scenes, Fabio Mauri and his work Che cos'è il fascismo from the 1970s. And in fact, the resonance was there all the way through to his very final book, the last book he published before he was murdered in May 1975, was this poetry collection, which isn't very much read or studied, actually, La Nuova Gioventù. But there on the cover of La Nuova Gioventù is not quite the same photo, but pretty close. This is Pasolini from a couple of years before in fascist uniform. I think it says Moschettieri, so I think it means he was probably 16 or so at the time, a few years earlier, staring out at us. And I'd like to kind of push the photographic side also as a side project in what I'm doing, and to kind of insert these icons into what is by now a very rich and powerful iconography of Pasolini, both during his life and after, often filtered through the photographic medium. Thanks, I'll stop there.
First, thank you all for being here. And thanks to Stephanos for his invitation and for taking me up on the November 1st idea. It is a privilege to be in conversation both with Robert Gordon, whose book Pasolini Forms of Subjectivity paved the way for other Anglophone scholars interested in Pasolini and remains essential Pasolini reading, and Merjian, whose writings on Pasolini art in America are very much needed and who has also been a generous colleague. Lastly, I feel very lucky to honor Pasolini's memory in this way, in this place. Pasolini loved New York, and yeah, I think he would be pleased. When I sat down to decide on a title for my talk today, I thought, well, I would speak about Pasolini and abortion, which is ultimately what I do end up speaking about. But a friend said, no, that's really a bad title. You're gonna like turn off a lot of people, especially given what's happening this week. And I thought about it further, and I realized that abortion per se was also not really what Pasolini was talking about when he talked about abortion either, which is characteristic of Pasolini. To him, the legalization of abortion was a symptom of social change. His views on abortion, in turn, are symptomatic of his own personal, frequently narcissistic ontology and conception of self. Pasolini airs his views on abortion chiefly in early 1975 in response to a proposed referendum to fully decriminalize abortion in Italy, which had only been very partially decriminalized in 1973. In these statements, he echoes the main threads of critique in his work in this period. He laments, for example, the dehumanizing and hegemonic tendencies of consumer culture, the violence of contemporary politics and social norms, and the evil of power in its various guises. Here, as elsewhere, Pasolini seems trapped in his own private worldview that he has difficulty imparting or communicating to others, and he is really, actually, as we will see in a moment, on his own planet. And yet, at first glance, the discussion finds him closer to the language of a tangible, circumscribed political discourse, I guess because it is about an actual policy issue. And it also is interesting to me because his discussions of abortion, because you see Pasolini actually trying to articulate, which he doesn't do so often in his political writings, a life-affirming rationale for his own politics. So his politics are always life-affirming, but he was very prone to despair in those last years. And like a majority of Italian citizens, and like radical leftists such as Marco Pannella, who spearheaded the campaign to make divorce legal in Italy, Pasolini was ultimately in favor of the proposed referendum to legalize abortion, one of 8 put forward by Italy's Radical Party in 1974, and its ratification, which had at the time begun to look like a real possibility. In Italy, the tide of public opinion had shifted to such a degree that by late 1974, Pope Paul VI issued a statement affirming the Church's condemnation of procured abortion, yet requesting that believers not argue or retaliate against the procedure's likely legalization. In a series of impassioned interventions in Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera and left-wing paper Paese Sera from January to March 1975, Pasolini voiced both his firm support for the referendum and his hatred of abortion. In a participatory democracy, he argued the law should reflect the decisions of a majority. At the same time, he argued that abortion was homicide and the legalization of abortion, therefore the legalization of homicide. As an alternative, he advocated the use of sexual education and birth control measures that would make abortion a last resort. Quote, when the legalization of abortion is at stake, the evil has already been done. There is nothing to do but to choose the most expeditious, most logical means of euthanasia available, end quote. asked by Jean Deflot in an interview to clarify whether the term euthanasia in this context did not excessively criminalize the practice of abortion, Pasolini claimed that words were nothing to be afraid of and that abortion was only the worst of quote unquote good deaths. Pasolini's statements on abortion are troubling, I think for obvious reasons. And as Dacia Marini and other feminists at the time pointed out, Pasolini, when he speaks about abortion, ignores women entirely. And then when he is attacked for his views, continues to make the discourse of abortion a platform for his own self-defense. And essentially the question of the right to abort disappears entirely. And when he does talk about the referendum, he's usually splitting hairs over the arguments used by radicals in favor of abortion. He ultimately actually starts giving his opponents, the opponents of the referendum, more materials for their cause. And he definitely ignored Italo Calvino's comments that before speaking about these things, any man should bite his tongue 3 times. Pasolini's interventions on abortion, which privilege fetal personhood and treat abortion as a crime, have required me to reevaluate my appraisal of his thoughts, but I also find them intriguing. While they mirror in places certain conservative arguments for abortion now, they are stamped by his weirdness and strangeness and deeply rooted in his eclectic worldview. And I'm going to also be speaking about Pasolini before Pasolini, but in a different sense. What I find striking about Pasolini's thoughts on abortion is their through line. The protagonist of them is Pasolini fetus, a fetal iteration of self that Pasolini invokes as both his muse and the helpless entity that he must defend. Pasolini fetus is a sentient being with consequences for the present. Pasolini fetus is there to tell us what we rarely talk about when we talk about medical abortion in a general or legal sense, which is individuals' terrifying nostalgia for themselves and the potential of themselves, I guess. By constantly referring to Pasolini fetus in the abortion debates and elsewhere, Pasolini Sr. insists that fetal life is biography and therefore destiny. He also forces us to reflect on the fetal life that might be part of our own autobiographies. He is, I would argue, not merely interested in the fact that we exist or might not exist. He is interested in imagining the sensations of the fetus and the way that our memories of that experience consciously or unconsciously shape our experience as embodied individuals. Pasolini's chief flaw is that he can only see abortion from this fetal point of view. Pasolini makes his first reference to Pasolini fetus in January 1975 in a statement which affirms his support of legalization on democratic grounds, yet denounces the arguments of radicals and progressives in favor of legalization. Quote, "I am," he writes, "traumatized by the legalization of abortion because I consider it, as many do, a crime. In my dreams and in my daily life, a thing common to all men, I live my prenatal life, my happy immersion in the maternal waters. I know that I existed there. I will limit myself to saying this because, with regards to abortion, I have more urgent things to say. That life is sacred is obvious," end quote. In the article's remainder, Pasolini weaponizes abortion, making it fit within his more sustained attack in the period on false tolerance, his elaboration of anthropological revolution or mutation, the social change he immortalized as the disappearance of the fireflies. And he also argues that the abortion debates have left sexual intercourse out of the equation, and that any legitimate debate about abortion ought to address sexual norms that make abortion necessary. And he goes on to address several other topics that are his pet peeves at the moment. He makes a case of that abortion coincides with an increased incidence of homophobia because of its celebration of the heteronormative couple and its sanctioning of the couple. So I'm getting some strange looks, but that's Pasolini. It's true, you know. He's out there. And he also makes the case that the big mistake of radicals is not to make an ecological argument for abortion, that if they really wanted a very ethical case, they should make a case that it was legal on demographic grounds. And of course, this article triggered angry reactions among different intellectuals, and he was prepared for them. Many people, he concluded at the end of his first big article, quote, "without the virile and rational capacity of comprehension, will accuse my intervention of being personal, peculiar, minoritarian, and so what?" Pasolini responded to his opponents or his which included, I mean, this is a debate that is very central to Italian politics at the time. Everybody is taking part. Moravia, Calvino, anyone whose name you've heard in Italian letters for sure. And he responded then by clarifying frequently his earlier position, but also returning to his belief that abortion was a crime. So he did reiterate or try to make clear that he did not condemn women who had abortions or men who advocated abortions or who agreed that abortions were good choices. So it's not a moral issue for him. But he considers abortion a crime because of his belief in the living existence of the fetus. Quotes, "I know that in no other phenomenon of existence is there an equally furious, total, and essential will to life as in the fetus. The fetus's anxiety to actualize its own potentiality has something irresistible and therefore absolute and joyful about it, even if an imbecile is born after." And I won't go into details here because it's a big topic, but this actually is part of Pasolini's larger discussions of fascism in the period when he is constantly returning to ways in which Nazi programs, in particular Nazi policies, were being, in his view, revived. Or so the reference to imbecile here, even though we think it jars us, is his way of referring to the extermination of life that is deemed unworthy of being lived. And he classed himself in that category as a homosexual who would have also been subject to extermination in certain fascist settings. In this letter, the letter that where he makes this argument for the will to live of the fetus, Pasolini cites the source that is key to understanding his line of thoughts here, which is Hungarian psychoanalyst Sándor Ferenczi's book from 1924, Thalassa, A Theory of Genitality, in which Ferenczi puts forth a complex and controversial speculative theory of genital pleasure and psychological development, which posits that humans want to return to the womb their whole lives, and that individual sexual lives, the act of intercourse itself, and other fantasies are unconscious expressions of this desire, a desire which Ferenczi calls thalassic, and is one that is symbolized or represented by the sea. And in references to the source reappear in many texts, in many of Pasolini's writings in this period. So he's always talking about himself having dreams where he's in the water and he's happy and so forth. And this logic is at work in all of his later statements on abortion. In a March column, for instance, Pasolini argues again that abortion has something in it which, quote, unleashes dark forces in us, which come before intercourse, and that it, quote, imposes the question of our eros and its unlimitedness, end quote. And I'm going to skip a bit since I think we're running out of time, but in all of this, he's not really concerned about the experience of the mother, although he's always reiterating his affection for his mother, which is a big theme throughout his life, and how fundamental this relationship to his mother is, even in the context of this debate. In a letter to Alberto Moravia, Pasolini offers his defining statement on the matter. He considers abortion a sin that should not be considered a crime. And he also insists that what he is interested in or is concerned in is the life of the fetus in the singular rather than in a general sense. When I say, quote, that there is a human life involved, I am speaking of this human life, this singular concrete human life, which in this moment finds itself inside the womb of this mother. And he goes on to ask, is it necessary at all costs to create the unconditioned precedent for genocide just because the status quo demands it? Pasolini defends the sentimentality of his views here as elsewhere. He calls Moravia a cynic and says Moravia must think that his views are idealistic nonsense. But he also tells us in these contributions that these sentiments, his irrational sentiments about his fetal life, should have a place in any critical discussion of matters that concern all members of society, not these views per se, but sentiments in general, sentimentality, emotional life. But these emotional impulses should especially find a venue in any situation or question where there was, quote, again, a human life involved. Pasolini's fetal politics, which take the sanctity of the individual as their foundation and assert the moral, ethical, and epistemological legitimacy of pre-rational and irrational experience in the realm of politics, are consistent with his other views in the same period. Behind his critique of the liberalized sexual practices that legal abortions make easier is his more monolithic and tragic denunciation of capitalism and fascism, his belief that contemporary modes of production, governance, and relating were destroying individuality, cultural tradition, and basic human instincts of compassion. As he says in one article on abortion, quote, to say that life is not sacred does the producers a great favor, end quote. And yet, Pasolini's thoughts on abortion also have a life and afterlife of their own. I find his politics here instructive because he quite literally takes his fetal position as a figure for thought. He is aware of the solipsism of his own views instead of couching this solipsism, this extremely self-referential quality, in more objective arguments. He argues that this self-referential quality is precisely what makes his views, when reasoned upon, when treated, analyzed, and explained, critical and political. Here, the personal is political precisely because Pasolini believed in democracy as the collective form of individuals created by individuals. And I don't discuss it here, but the idea of Pasolini fetus is central to his novel Petrolio, in which the idea of form and of fetal form becomes actually also the narrative sort of impulse of the novel. And that's something that Armando Maggi has written about. So he believes that democracy is the collective form of individuals. And he also believes in law as the institution that gives formal substance to individuals' lived realities and preferences. As a democratic thinker, he supports the legalization of abortion, but as an individual, he considers abortion homicide. The two views are not mutually exclusive. His plea for the fetus, not in terms of legal personhood, but in terms of psychosexual personhood and fetal memory, offers as well an alternative psychoanalytical take on why abortion bothers some people. Instincts towards self-preservation and allegiance to self are at stake wherever abortion is on the table. He points out that secular or religious arguments for or against abortion or other policy issues obscure the fact that existential fears and doubts ultimately contaminate all political discussions. Cultural apparatuses give us frameworks for making sense of and taming these fears, which is why appeals to fear and control are so successful in the realm of politics. In recent years, Pasolini has become an unlikely poster child for pro-life groups in Italy. Today, I suspect one group or another will repost his statements on abortion, as one and several groups have done in the past, and they usually do so on the anniversary of Pasolini's murder. And we can lament this misuse. Obviously, he is in favor of the legalization of abortion, but I think we can also honor with him at least the fetus that became Pier Paolo Pasolini, and the strange fruits that his yearning for the maternal waters or the maternal womb reaped. Thank you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you to Stefanos, of course. Thank you to Amy and Sam, who's not here. And we're actually we've been planning another conference that's happening in a couple of weeks on surrealism, and I just can't stress enough how helpful Amy and Sam have been. It's been just so wonderful to work with you guys. And I'm thrilled to be here with colleagues and friends like Margaret and Robert. So just starting out with this pair of quotes here by Breton. Wherever the Hegelian dialectic does not function, there is no other thought. There is no thought, no hope for truth in me. And Pasolini, from his interviews with Jean Bufflot, insofar as there prevails in me a vision of reality that is hieratic and I'm immobile, I contradict my Marxism, and more radically, what Hegelianism revealed to me about movement. I enter into contradiction with the dialectic. So this essay in progress evolved out of a number of things. I'm finishing up now these next two books. One is on Pasolini in America and Pasolini in art history, both of which are supposed to come out next year. And then I'm never writing anything on Pasolini again. And if I do, someone please stop me if I do. But this is a topic that I still can't get out of my system. Inspired by a number of different overlapping things, including a student who just finished a brilliant dissertation this fall on Pasolini, Bloch, and Bresson and romantic anti-capitalism. A lot of the issues of which are at play here, but so here we go. The bugbears of the Surrealist movement were many and various: fathers and fatherland, bourgeois propriety and academic pretension. These all assumed a range of embodiments in Surrealism's pantheon of irritants: Anatole France and Victor Hugo, Comte and Claudel. Perhaps no straw man invited the group's anathema more consistently, however, than the specter of Christian dogma. It was against the actual and allegorical orthodoxy of the Catholic Church that the Surrealists measured their profanations, whether visual or verbal. Think of Max Ernst's The Virgin spanking the Christ child before three witnesses of 1926, or the celebrated photograph of the poet Benjamin Perret insulting a Spanish priest in the pages of La Révolution Surréaliste. Of the Belgian Surrealist group vowing to make the lives of young clerics, quote-unquote, unbearable, or Antonin Artaud pledging to, quote, shit on the Christian virtues. André Breton's renown, not only as the group's founder, but its pope, speaks obliquely to that same irreverence. Yet the Surrealists never shied from attacking actual theological authority. Their Adresse au Pape hectors the pontiff ad hominem, quote, we don't care for your canon, index, sin, confessional, or clergy. We think of a different war, a war on you, Pope, dog, end quote. The same organ declared the year 1925 the end of the Christian era, a resetting of historical time, calling to mind, perhaps self-consciously, the French Revolution's new era of liberty. Yet a more recent precedent lay across the Alps in Mussolini's no less revolutionary calendar, its year zero marking the 1922 March on Rome. Born the same year, Pasolini proved in some ways no less contentious in his rapport with the European avant-gardes than with the fascist regime. A year before its ignoble end, a young Pasolini declared, quote, we consider the period of reviews, of trends, in short, of isms, to be not only over, but very remote. As the film scholar Naomi Green writes, Pasolini came to believe it incumbent upon the committed writer to, quote, avoid the precious irrationalism that inspired not only the involution of a Rimbaud, a Proust, but also the private literature of the fascist state. Whatever distance he claimed to take from such trends and isms, Pasolini's poetics absorbed their legacies through and through, from the pre-avant-garde of French symbolism to Lorca's verse to the lyrical redoubt of Italian Hermeticism. By his own account, in fact, it was the poetry of Rimbaud which converted him in the early 1940s to the cause of anti-fascism. The appearance of the poet's verse near the crotch of the otherworldly visitor in Pasolini's Teorema perhaps recalls this conversion, an epiphany as erotic as it was ideological. And there's a lot of resonance with what Robert was talking about in terms of his, the seduction of anti-fascism as having, as much as fascism had its own kind of erotic appeals, so too did a certain poetics of anti-fascism, or that could be perceived or lived as anti-fascist. And his biographer and friend, Enzo Siciliano, said that it was a school teacher who read aloud Rimbaud in class, that it was at that moment that Pasolini said that he stopped being a quote-unquote natural fascist. Yet the same film's Teorema's other visual and narratological transgressions, dubbed by critics everything from cubist to neo-surrealist, beg questions about Pasolini's consignment of the avant-garde to the dustbin of history. As various scholars have noted, his modernist penchants manifest themselves in everything from quote-unquote antinomial and collage-like forms, that's Zig Baranski, to admixtures of Petrarch and Lautréamont, to applications of a quote-unquote meta-historical surrealism. It is this last ism which has remained almost entirely unexplored with regard to Pasolini's vast corpus, a rapport which exposes, I think, a seam of ideas yet to be understood in their complex relationship to Marxist theory, to avant-garde aesthetics, and to an ideology of liberation. In his own attachment to a confessional and expressive poetics, steeped in an eccentric strain of Marxist meliorism, Pasolini reflected surrealist precedent far more than he would have liked to admit. His penchant for lyrical interiority or for interior lyricisms defied the communist doctrine of realism and collectivity on the one hand, and flouted neo-avant-garde injunctions against self-indulgent subjectivity on the other. Let's hear the voice of one of those avant-garde, neo-avant-garde affiliates attacking Pasolini in 1961, Angelo Guglielmi. Quote, in point of fact, Pasolini's Marxism is rather suspect, culturally imprecise, open to contamination of every type, an instrument for the production of irrationalism. He sets about striking one thing against another according to a vaguely Marxist recipe. From the resulting detonations ripple the obscure intimacy of things. Naturally, Pasolini is interested only in this obscurity and not for the purpose of approaching it rationally, or even in order to problematize it in an existential sense. Rather, he seeks only to perceive according to notions of pure sense, thereby establishing an understanding of the physical type. And I won't get into the sort of almost anecdotal and various kind of historiographic relationships between Pasolini and surrealism, which extend from his sort of oblique citations of work by a painter like De Chirico, who his mentor Roberto Longhi famously completely held in contempt, although it was under Longhi that Pasolini began his undergraduate thesis on the other painters of the so-called metaphysical school, Carrà, Morandi, and De Pisis. And when you read both Pasolini and De Chirico about the sort of imminence of transcendence in things, about the notion of hierophanies and of quote unquote the primitive consciousness of the individual, and the kind of revelatory state of that sort of primitive pre-grammatical conscience, there is much to be explored. Of course, in other sort of anecdotal uh, relationships, Pasolini actually met Man Ray in the 70s. He was actually wanted to meet him to ask him permission eventually to use his imaginary portrait of the Marquis de Sade for the poster for Salon, which is of course based on very loosely on the 120 Days of Sodom. And in an unused sequence from Uccellace Uccellini of 1966, which itself has been referred to as a kind of, in some ways, a surrealist, picaresque, Marxist tale. You have this entire sequence with Totò, who is standing before this montage of post-war French intellectuals, including not only Sartre and Le Corbusier, but also on the left there, the leonine head of André Breton. So described by one critic as quote unquote subversive of narrative expectations, informed by highly eccentric reading of Marx and Freud, Pasolini's work indulges in all sorts of quote unquote obvious fetishisms. His work would thus seem, at least articulated through such appraisals, entirely congruous with the basic surrealist ethos. But tellingly, Louis Valentin, in a 1970 interview, adds a third idol in a tellingly Catholic trinity, that of Christ. And if we listen to Pasolini himself, I think it's telling to hear him articulate, quote, "I am not interested in deconsecrating. That is a fashion I hate. It is petit bourgeois. I want to reconsecrate things as much as possible. I want to re-mythicize them." And here I think it eventually will be important to take into account not just the sort of orthodox surrealism of someone like André Breton, but the quote unquote dissident surrealism of Georges Bataille and his attachment to Nietzsche. Here is Bataille, quote, "It could be said to be dangerous for surrealism to situate experience exclusively on the evidence from writers and poets, to neglect the extreme rigor and passion of those who wanted to take the human adventure to its limit through Christianity. In one respect, the free violence of poets alone corresponds to the current enthusiasms, but it lacks a resolution that exhausts what is possible. The first enemy of Christianity, Nietzsche, seems to me much better informed when he writes, quote, "We want to be the inheritors of mediation and of Christian insight, to go completely beyond Christianity by means of a hyper-Christianity, rather than be content with breaking away from it." And this is obviously a much larger issue, but the crux of it is an age-old kind of specter of Pasolini studies, right? Which is that he was not only the bugbear of the right wing and of conservatives and the bourgeoisie, but also of the Marxist left, because he was a crypto Catholic, right? He was an atheist who professed, as he quoted, to have a deep nostalgia for belief. And so the place of Catholicism in his Marxism is a complex and complicated one. I think this is really only just one strain of it. I mean, I don't think that Pasolini's relationship to surrealism is in any way sort of the key to understanding his work at large. But it is very much, I think, essential in thinking about how he intended to reconcile a certain kind of obviously anti-bourgeois, anti-capitalist ideology with some sort of investment in transcendental belief, however conceived. And more specifically, there are three things that I think really kind of anchor the question or the problem. One, Pasolini said that the sign under which he worked was quote unquote contamination. Contamination in Pasolini entails a number of different things that have gone by a number of different monikers, everything from pastiche to postmodernism to mannerism. But essentially, it means this anti-dialectical preservation of differences, which leaves him in some ways at odds with traditional Marxism and the dialectic, the idea of a forward, progressive march towards synthesis. Pasolini's conjoining of different terms always entailed a preservation of their difference. And this is something that obviously sets him at odds with the at least ostensibly dialectical strain of surrealism. But I don't think that they can be sort of thrown out just offhand. And there's a scholar, very interesting scholar named E. San Juan, who wrote a very interesting article years ago about sort of a speculative article about Gramsci and surrealism. Gramsci never wrote a word about surrealism, but it was an entirely speculative article about what Gramsci might have thought about surrealism based on his exchanges with Lunacharsky, his remarks on futurism. And San Juan writes, quote, "The chronotope of revolution is essentially a collage, more precisely a montage of transformations that amalgamate contraries, oppositions, disparities." And that relates to the second, I think, sort of anchor here, and that is Pasolini's, one of his kind of anthems was Magma non amalgata, which is obviously a kind of play just on the sonority of the words, but it's translated loosely as a non-amalgamated magma. Pasolini was interested in what Bataille in some ways would have called the informe, in a kind of poetic, a lyrical, even embodied experience that is not yet shaped in and by and through language. Pasolini was sort of obsessed with the pre-grammatical, and that is connected to the third sort of anchor, which is his theory of the cinema of poetry. His momentous revolutionary theory of the cinema in the 1960s, the cinema of poetry, essentially argued that all of cinema, even commercial cinema, is haunted by a sort of a kind of unconscious, essentially, a limitation of language. And so this is in some ways kind of will be the largest thing to explore, but very interestingly, his Acatone of 1961, and we can just start to end here. One of the first films in certainly in post-war Italian cinema to have a dream sequence, which of course was in some ways anathema to neorealism, right? This notion of cinema's attachment to the real, to the empirical. And Acatone was as much a break with neorealism as it was a continuation. But very interesting that he also very much not coincidentally came to write about Buñuel and Chien Andalou. And he talks about Buñuel's Chien Andalou as and sort of pure expressivity. And this is a sequence that I think in some ways even was an unconscious kind of allusion to the film, which as Brescio Viejo, who's here actually, has written about as not being just a completely avant-garde film, but actually return in some ways to narrative at a time in the late 20s when avant-garde cinema was completely essentially heading towards the formalist. But again, Pasolini's notions on how the cinema could express interiority or not are very much a crux of that essay. And I probably don't need to tell anyone in this room that the problem of interiority to the project of communism was abidingly complex and fraught one, even or especially in the 1960s. So that's where I'm headed with this material.
Would either of you want to jump into the first question to the others, or?
Whatever you like.
I mean, the floor is open. I have a question, but if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves, would you?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Filippo Trentin. I teach Italian studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And I have two questions, I think one for Robert. Ferrari, and I think, Robert, I was interested in, you just mentioned it en passant, the erotic element, by looking at these pictures, or like the experiences that Pasolini might have had in this kind of like week in Weimar. And there's like letters, I think, in his like letters contemporary to that period, in which I think this eroticism kind of like actually emerges. He has these like passages on like actually about fireflies, or like looking like green lights, when he's like walking with his friends like in these hills outside of like Bologna. But then, as you pointed out, the Poesia Casarsa, it's kind of also contemporaneous to that. So it's a bit weird to think of Poesia Casarsa as like being embedded into like a sort of like eroticized element connected to fascism. There is surely an eroticization of like the countryside and bodies as well. While in Salò, you have an eroticization of fascism. So I was just wondering how you are thinking through this this question of eroticism in these different phases of Pasolini's career. And then, yeah, I was just like one anecdotal question. I saw that like in one of the pictures, it was like Christopher Marcos that you mentioned. Is the same Christopher Marcos of like the Andy Warhol's group? Okay, so I was like interested and curious to know a bit more maybe about what type of dynamics were operating in that group.
Thanks, yeah. Thanks for picking up on that. I mean, I think like you raise what is a kind of general challenge for a project of mine, which is desperately trying to kind of keep the boundaries, right? So having worked a long time ago on a PhD and then a book which was like trying to piracy Pasolini's writings, which, as we all know, is hellish. This project was, you know, I wanted to say, no, let's see the value actually of kind of focusing in on a week or maybe 2 weeks at most, even within the field which does exist, by the way, of kind of the specialists in Pasolini's use, right? So the handful very kind of concertedly on his Bologna period, and let's say Bologna, Friuli, where he was kind of between the two, let's say, in this period. So even they have neglected this one kind of niche moment, which I want to kind of recover. So yeah, generally speaking, then I'm trying to avoid, but then failing at each step, this kind of seepage to a kind of loose sense of essence of Pasolini, which therefore there is some kind of strained continuity. And this question about the erotics is an example of that, right? In some ways, it's like, so we know that's what he did everywhere, right? We know that's what he did in New York, right? He was kind of as much on the lookout for kind of erotic experience as he was in poets and artists and intellectuals. And indeed, this was the same thing for him, right? It was a kind of undifferentiated actual bodily kind of encounter. And it's extremely tempting, therefore, to read back. And I'm trying to stop myself automatically reading back. It's like, oh, well, if Pasolini, I think this was his first trip outside of Italy. I can't see any evidence in abroad before. And I think it must have been extraordinary, even however much he doesn't write about it or expresses it to some degree. It was first trip abroad. He's surrounded by thousands of young, bright young, largely Aryan types. He was like, yeah. So a certain perspective would say, well, of course he was having sex as well as looking at book exhibitions and discussing Garcia Lorca.
Maybe if there were some Swarthy or Hungarian.
Right, there were. All options were available. So yeah, I want to try and stop myself from automatically assuming that. On the other hand, I think it's extraordinary actually that in this and in a couple of other of these articles from very around this period where he's talking quite dully in some sense about debates within literature, lyric poetry, quite closed in on a kind of student sort of literature stuff. That he opens, and he does it in another couple of arts with this outflow of affect, emotion, euphoria. So I think there's a frisson there undoubtedly, which I want to call it a kind of erotics of writing or encounter, whether or not it's a kind of a pure prurient record of what he was doing sort of in the night times. Sorry, I'm going.
Yeah, so that meeting with Man Ray was it had a couple of sort of upshot. I mean, he didn't end up using the poster of Desaad. He did talk about Man Ray in an article that he wrote about Warhol's exhibition in Ferrara in '75 called Ladies and Gentlemen. And he actually talked about that meeting, how he said to Man Ray that he was working on a film called Salaud, and that Man Ray understood him as saying salaud in French, bastard, and that for Pasolini, this underscored a kind of deep historical ignorance about history, basically, that he also kind of talked about with regard to Warhol. But at that meeting, he also was introduced to Dino Pedriali, who was the photographer who then took all of these photographs of him, both clothed and unclothed, that he was going to use for Petrolio. And so, yes, I think Makos was also, he was sort of one of Warhol's, right, most common photographers, but I think he also photographed his trip in Italy. I'm not sure.
I'm Martina Hessler, I'm a fellow. I'm interested in the concept of conversion. So Robert didn't. And I wonder, could you talk about a conversion? And I would critically ask if the concept of conversion makes sense, because maybe it's based on the assumption of a coherent biography.
I mean, for me, it's always fascinated me, this notion of, that a nation that lives under fascism for 20 years goes through a process of conversion to anti-fascism and to, was there such a thing as fascist subjectivity after 20 years? Right? And what does it mean to suddenly be told that you have false consciousness after 20 years, right? So Pasolini saying that he ceased being a natural fascist after hearing the poetry of Rimbaud does speak to some sort of conversion, but it's ideologically coherent. I mean, I don't think that conversion has to be ideologically coherent. I think in fact it can be. Yeah, I mean, I think in this context, I'm also just interested in interest in the forms and the rituals of religion, of which we might conclude conversion without their theological piety. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, I don't know. Maybe another figure that would be more perhaps in tune with Pasolini would be revelation, like epiphany. Perhaps. That's kind of that's one of his mental mechanisms. So, like Rimbaud, it's like exactly like you encounter something with a kind of moment of revelation, which.
Yeah, he talked about fulminazione, which is like a kind of revelation or epiphany.
Does that work? With
I mean, I
with
would
Edgar?
say that because he's so psychoanalytical, like his theory of self is an accretion of all these different. So Pasolini doesn't think that a total conversion, nor desirable, right? That would, which is, I mean, part of. Obviously, he's in tune with other critical theorists who also consider religions forms of alienation, but I think that that psychoanalytic notion of a self that has always been constantly
definitely is.
By the way, Theorem Teorema is a film on not conversion, but of a kind of catastrophic transformation, which is a verse form of revelation and a revelation.
Is it possible to ask a similar question? Just to say, you know, seen from Pasolini's perspective alone, this seems paradoxical, and seen from a perspective with like particular reference frameworks, Marxism, some of this seems seen across a sort of broader, perhaps longer standing intellectual position, more akin to, let's say, French nonconformism. This agglomeration or this kind of amalgam, which I still like that work, makes quite good sense, even if it reaches a certain kind of radical version with him. That is to say, there's a kind of relatively vague spiritualism which can translate into in a particular direction or other. There are elements of conservatism which persist the more Marxist commitment can be articulated. You know, and when it's not articulated, then all we hear are the conservative moments, regardless of the professed version of the left. In some ways, this is a kind of mirror image of a certain kind of bourgeois, you know, a kind of left-wing bourgeois in much of Europe in the post-war period. So I'm curious whether there isn't a kind of system in which this would belong, or whether you think that this is just a kind of over-assumption. That I guess this is for all three of you.
I mean, I think a term that's interesting in that regard, it might be nostalgia, that in a sense, Pasolini is working within a framework of, well, let's say not in the period I was presenting about, but in his kind of mainstream, like he's in dialogue with his kind of Marxist fellows, as it were, but constantly pushing in his kind of contrarian way. It's like, and his scandal, it was a buzzword of his whole oeuvre, was to take up a position that can be scandalous. Which means, yeah, sort of heterodox with respect to your circle or network of interlocutors. So he would push that kind of Christian language in the face of kind of Marxist language. Yeah, and I think that nostalgia, is a way of doing this with history, as it were. He would push a kind of, and this is another way, very much in parallel with the abortion, where he gets the first time that he was reclaimed by the right, let's say, was over his kind of provincialism, right? Nostalgia for an authentic rural regional localism, which the Lombard League, as it was then, was kind of appealing to, and then trying to appropriate back. Perhaps not the first time. Let's say that the abortion was the first time because he was still around, but like, as it were, in the kind of later legacy moment. So maybe what you're saying kind of resonates for me with a bit with that you have to kind of hold on to his situational position and then watch him pushing at boundaries and dreaming of a past that is only contrary with relation to a kind of perspective of the future, dialectic and so on. But on its own, it doesn't make that much sense, really. But I think it's right that that's a kind of fairly typical kind of game to play. Intellectual.
Will and Andrew. Let's maybe take two at a time so that we
Thank you. I just wanted to ask on the question of the 1942 conference. How self-conscious was this, like fascist internationalism? I mean, were they shadow boxing with how communist everything looked? The unity of nations, this memorabilia. I suppose there's also liberal internationalisms. And also I wanted to ask, how did their own racial hierarchies fit into this? I mean, obviously, how pro-Italian were German Nazis? How disappointing was it for Italians to meet, presumably racist Nazis, or maybe they had suddenly discovered that they were pro-Southern Europe? And then that quote you showed on the screen about actually inquired, you can discover that in the old Europe, freedom and intelligence are still alive. I, it seems, I know I'm misreading it, but that seems to me like he's saying somehow he's put in the middle of a fascist magazine. Don't worry, there's still culture. We're still, and what is actually your direct reading of that quote? Because it's just so tantalizing.
Hi, my question is about abortion. Thank you. That was a fascinating paper. And what I would like to hear more about is you mentioned the sort of the critique, the backlash, especially from the left. And what I wonder is, was there also a way in which it gained any traction, especially on the left? Did anyone pick up on this, or was it just such an idiosyncratic sort of position?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah, thanks so much. So yeah, this well, the first part of your question, I'm not sure if I got right. I mean, it was very concertedly a kind of Nazi fascist Europe gathering, part of a sequence of gathering that took most closely related to. There was a conference in March 42, a smaller event. There was a larger event of the sort of Nazi fascist youth movement for Europe in Vienna towards the end of 42, but this was the kind of largest of gatherings. And it was very concertedly planned as a European-wide, but led in the organization and the conceptualization by a kind of bickering series of fascist Germans and Italians. Germans and Italians were taking the lead, the other nations were drawn in with their kind of hyper-nationalistic local fascisms, but all to the service of a vision, at least, a notion of a new European order. So there were echoes and resonances of other liberal internationalism, not so much Soviet, I don't think, not directly, but there was talk of seeing what, say, Penn was doing with the kind of International Writers Association a year or two earlier. There were higher, more elite writers' organizations being set up, Nazi fascist. But anyway, so it was very concertedly that. That quote is me selecting, right? The other fellows from Remarque got the chance to read the whole article, and they know that it's kind of these quotes are drawn out of a short article, half of which is quite clearly hyper-nationalistic. Italian culture is the greatest culture in Europe, and we must take the lead because we have the Renaissance, because we have the tradition. Part of it is this euphoric personal memory of encounter and dialogue, and part of it is a kind of obfuscated literary analysis of where the current state of the literary tradition lies in today's Europe. So there's a kind of strange hybrid. But if you extract sentences like that, yeah, you certainly can. He's doing something quite bold, which wasn't unusual for the time. Little flashes of potential autonomy, let's say, embedded in an fairly conventional.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think so. Pasolini was a broken record by this point. I mean, he's still saying new things, obviously, like about a fetus, but and he's in the big newspapers, right? He's a public celebrity, and so everybody is reading this. Everybody knows what's happening. He's on television. I think the bit about the fetus and obsession with the fetus, people mocked a great deal. And, then he would charge them with they never had this experience of dreaming about their maternal waters. So what, how could they attack him for that belief? And he also accused many of his detractors of their own misogyny, because they're also not interested in what motherhood meant either. Hellish to work on Pasolini, so we end up working on the edit side of things. He is his attacks do make him, or his conception of fetal personhood in this way was taken very badly by feminists in particular. And so actually when I right when I started my dissertation, I worked with Victoria de Grazia. She said, "Oh, we hated Pasolini," right? Like, and she hated Pasolini for these reasons. I would say he's part of a larger Ferenczi renaissance at the time, that in Italy in those years and in France, Ferenczi's collected writings were republished in several volumes. And so these are not totally new topics, and I guess some of my work has been showing that, yeah, this general zeitgeist, there, what we might consider fringe now ideas were actually very beloved and by also more quote unquote, you know, critical theorists of all stripes. So Jung is not, you know, you can talk about Jung in the newspaper and nobody will.
David or Paolo?
Question to Margaret just about the in Pasolini that he pro, you know, role that he's kind of against. I think what you say is that the pro-life groups have recently picked up on Pasolini. Not really surprising, quite a fine distinction. Idea of abortion. Because I think you say his notion of democracy is founded on individual freedom. That's an individual freedom. But you know, he's in a kind of strange bind there. I don't think it's at all surprising. A group in Italy called No Quattro, abrogate the law. Very, very scary movement, but it's not. Anyway, I just wanted to ask you about that.
No, it's not surprising at all. I mean, he repeats over and over, and you know, that life is sacred, and he, even if he has a different conception of the sacred, and I think that that's one thing that is, even if you know, fundamentally Catholic, but secular notion of the sacred. I mean, I would say that I don't think it's been studied well enough. His actual conception of democracy is from the mid-60s onwards. He has this moment of reckoning with the failures of communism as an actual discourse form. And in that moment, then he does start channeling some of the debates about radical democracy from other places. And, you know, and with this period, in this moment, he's aligning both with the communists, and they're maintaining the party line, which is that abortion is a crime, but we legalize it, and the ultimately supporting the radicals. So he is in a tricky place. I would say it's not that democracy is about the freedom of individuals, and he was really against the language of rights. I think it is more that if participatory democracy is about every person in the room, then the majority decision counts. And in all of these abortion, not all, but the really bothersome thing about it is that he says the majority is stupid and wrong. But because that's what they want, this is what we should. So, and he also gets himself in a bind because he accuses the pro-referendum people of basically falling into pragmatic arguments for abortion, which are not strictly legal arguments, right? Like, abortion happens, therefore we should legalize it because it's going to happen anyway. But ultimately, he does the same thing, which is abortion happens. So, your point is well taken. I mean, he's a conservative, right? At the end of the day, like Pasolini is.
I think he's indefensible. I don't know. I mean.
No, you can.
I did have a question for Robert as well. Sorry if you don't mind. You said, I think I quoted you as saying, I don't want to reprise the debate about who was or wasn't a fascist, but I don't think that's very interesting. I think I know what you mean about that. There's so many conversion stories and, you know, main issue. But to me, it is an issue because, you know, Pasolini being who he was and being born when he was, born in 1950, the same year the fascism. His father's an army officer. He fought in World War I. early fascist, he's guards in Bologna. You know, why wouldn't he be a fascist as a child growing up? He's not a child of a socialist or a communist fascist person. So the kind of question of why he's there isn't really surprising to me. I mean, make that point in a way. But what's interesting is what happens afterwards. Why? I don't get this thing about, you know, I stopped being a natural fascist when I heard Rambo. I mean, nobody's natural fascist. Fascism is a political position. You're not born with it. So, you know, he acquired fascism through schooling, through propaganda. The question of how he loses it is really interesting.
Why don't you hold up, Pearl? You also.
Mine more follows from the last discussion. And I was wondering if there was a kind of link between Ara and Margaret's thinking. I mean, I was one of the people scrunching my face when you said that Pasolini thought having an abortion was more heterosexual than having a child. And obviously that sort of seems confusing. But I think it's interesting to try to make sense of the logic of the position and also the kind of consistency of his thought. And it does seem a mistake to kind of just draw straight lines between his anti-abortion position and the way we things articulated today in contemporary US or whatever. It's not the same logic. And I wondered, I mean, I was curious about whether it made sense to talk about his position as advocating understanding the fetus in terms of personhood, the way that we do here today. Because what struck me about the quotations, at least that I heard today, were that it's more about this kind of moment of almost a non-amalgamated magma of the fetus is not being presented as like a person formed in the body. It's this potential, almost in this Aristotelian sense of a kind of potential formation. And that what excites him, and this is where Thalassa makes perfect sense, is this kind of moment of potential. I recently reread Thalassa, and it's all about genitals and genital sex, and yet it's about the erasure of genitalia into this moment of kind of pre-individuation. So it struck me that there was a kind of link between the pre-grammatical, the pre-formative, and maybe his anti-abortion position kind of coming from an investment in that rather than an investment in like a person inside.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, David. That's, yeah, I mean, I think you're picking up on, I don't, it's not surprising absolutely that he was entirely kind of versed in that. And when Fascism Centenary in 1922 coincided with Pasolini's and sort of birth in 1922, and I went to see a kind of theatre performance in which these two were entirely run parallel. They're both kind of, strangely enough, they both have this kind of mythic legacy and they merge. And so, yeah, it's not, but as you know far better than anyone in the room, probably, right, the entire processing of fascism and the war in Italy's post-war was kind of revolved around this kind of question of how, like, the most influential early book on this was called The Long Journey Through Fascism, right, by someone slightly older than this, Ruggero Zangrandi, but essentially of Pasolini's generation of years. And this was the sort of trajectory that generation decided or had to tell itself of growing up under fascism, and then gradually in different ways, in different places and through different means, coming to some kind of revelation and then flipping. And by 1943 or 44, 45, you were a Marxist, or let's say you were a part of the anti-fascist resistance life. And where that collides with my project most directly is precisely in the other Weimar conference, right? The one that's always mistaken for this. Because Pintor, who was there, a few months later, was killed fighting for the resistance and became one of the great martyrs of the resistance, right? And then his image was kind of dismantled in a very well-known book, which was called The Brief Journey, right? Where it's sort of pointing out how he went to this Weimar conference at brackets, i.e. he was essentially a Nazi. He was philo German, sort of broadly sympathetic to fascism. So that debate has, in a sense, been had. Right? It's like, oh, when were you there? Why were you there? Were you a Nazi? When did you stop being a Nazi? It's not as though you can date it. It's not as though I don't think it's interesting to date it, but yeah, the process and where you find someone like Pasolini at this moment, at this stage, and in this scene seems to me an interesting way of actually kind of not replaying that kind of long journey. Like, where are we on the arc of evolution that brings Marxist? I just don't think there's a kind of logical narrative to that, or even an emotional narrative to that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a big question. Well, I mean, I didn't mean personhood, yeah, in the American sense, and that's what he is trying to distance himself. Even if he doesn't distance himself, I don't think that discourse was as like solidified as it is now. And so he's not speaking of a person, yeah, in a legal sense it is very much this unamalgamated fetus, as you're talking about, which is for instance conception. But I guess I think what's key about his notion that this individual fetus is sacred is that he believes that fetal experience is differentiated and defines the life of the individual that comes later. And so he's concerned actually with the loss of that potential experience. So it's not like it's just the loss of a human life, it is the loss of this experience, which he believes is fundamentally pleasurable and actually would be the thing that, I mean, not only, but because he thinks that, Ferenczi says like the substitution of desires is maturity in his account. So this tholastic desire, ends up in the genitalia find other directions to go in, but that still lingers in other places. And I think ultimately that those whatever is actually what the kind of sexuality that Pasolini is interested in, the one that is not sort of, he doesn't like the fact that eroticism or erotics have been sex and discourses of sex. It is complicated, the heteronormative, problem of the heteronormative couple. Basically, he thought that a smaller family, like if Italy had been imitating the American model, the consumer model of a smaller family, the two children and two parents is like the perfect consumer unit, right? That the parents have enough money, free time, that they can keep buying things and so forth. Whereas if you have all of these children about, it's still going to look like, I mean, that was his view. And so, yeah, so like the efficiency of capital was actually to narrow families rather.
So please join me in.